We're going to take you to Moscow now, where Pentagon and Russian defence officials are saying that they're getting closer to a deal on air safety in Syria.
Well, US and Russian aircraft flew within kilometres of each other at the weekend, with each accusing the other of being reckless. Moscow Times reporter Matthew Bodner joins us now live from the Russian capital. Matthew, thanks so much for taking out time to speak with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Firstly, before we talk more about Syria, there's been much talk here, and I presume there, in regard to the Dutch Safety Board's findings into the downing of MH17. What's been the reaction among the Russian people to that report?
Certainly. Well, it's been muted. So mostly what you've got from the Russians is a focus on downplaying the Commission's findings. Not so much downplaying, but discrediting them in the eyes of the Russian public. So this began on Tuesday morning when Almaz-Antey, the maker of the Buk missile, presented its own findings that sort of counteracted the Dutch report. It was very technical and somewhat confusing, but it boils down to the Russian claim that they didn't take Russia's evidence into account, and the entire thing was sort of designed to frame Russia. And meanwhile, you've seen comments from the deputy foreign minister and the Kremlin spokesman and the head of the Russian Aviation Authority, all questioning the professionalism of the Dutch report and its results. But in the end, Russians, I've seen some reactions, have sort of turned their attention back to Kiev, saying that maybe Ukraine should be to blame for what happened to MH17 for leaving its airspace open on that day. Of course, the airspace was closed below a certain altitude because no one knew there were Buks in the area. But mostly, there's been a lot of sleight of hand. Syria has been the dominant issue in the Russian media for the past 2 weeks, and it was not a big exception yesterday, aside from the attempts to discredit the Dutch report.
Well, Matthew, talk us through how the Syria issue is being reported there in Moscow, and particularly about this airspace and airstrikes. And of course, we have such conflicting reports when you look at what's reported within Moscow and then, of course, internationally.
Sure. Well, in general, Syria is being reported as a smashing success in the Russian media, also by the Russian Defense Ministry. We're seeing for the first time a very heavy use by the ministry of social media to get its message out. We're seeing daily Facebook and Twitter updates in English explaining how many missions were conducted, what targets they're hitting. They're even showing gun camera footage of the targets they're hitting. Yesterday, there was a statement about the airspace of the United States. And it seemed very cordial in its tone. It was saying that we're in regular video conference with our American colleagues, and we're trying to establish a set of operating rules in the area. But as far as I understand, these rules have not been established yet. They were being talked about by NATO last week. They're still being talked about here in Moscow as a potential. So it's hard to know exactly what's going on. But in general, the Russian campaign appears to be doing very well. It's a limited campaign, but based on the available information, it appears to be a success. One thing that sticks out is the rate at which Russian aircraft are flying and performing combat missions in Syria. Yesterday, they claimed to have done about 40 strikes. And the day before, they claimed to hit 86 ISIS facilities in Syria. This is with a force of about 30 planes. And so it's impressive by any metric. And so the general takeaway is that we're seeing a new and improved Russian military at work in Syria. And this plays very well at home. And this is how it's being sold.
Yeah, Matthew, further to that, how it is playing at home, a lot of what Mr. Putin does on the international stage, we've talked about MH17 in Syria, is perceived to be at odds with the West and the West's approach in regard to those issues at home. What effect does that have on Mr. Putin's standing as a leader among the populace?
Well, he's seen as a strong leader who's sort of restoring Russian international prestige, sticking it to the United States. It's important to note two numbers. With regards to MH17, recent opinion polls that I've seen only put about 3% of the population subscribing to what I guess you could call the Western narrative of events with MH17, that rebels shot it down with a Buk. Only 3%, and something like 60% thinks that the West was somehow involved. And moving back to Putin's approval ratings through all of this, he remains in the mid-80%. There's really no indication that anything he's done is unpopular in a broad consensus. And in Syria, I think for the moment will continue to be popular as long as they continue to paint it as an anti-ISIS campaign. because it's important to note that Russians do not distinguish between extremist groups operating in Syria. The notion of a moderate rebel force does not exist, and it's scoffed at. The Russian public has sort of been dealing with the threat of terrorism since the 90s. And so regardless of the flavor, they're fearful of any form of Islamic extremism. So sort of like ISIS, not ISIS, but they're all ISIS in the minds of the Russian public. And I think this is, you can consider this in evidence of Putin's strong leadership. I mean, there is some mandates that he is operating on, at least from the approval ratings. But then again, it's all cheerled by the Russian media.
Matthew, before we let you go, we might just ask one final thing, of course, is space launch,
Sure.
which has been delayed by 4 months until early 2016.
Sure.
Still doesn't seem to be affecting Putin's ratings there, even though he's been hassling people to get things done on time.
Yeah, it's just they only now reported the delay. I mean, there's been signs in the Russian media for months, but they continue to present Vostochny, the name of the new cosmodrome, as a great new facility, the most modern cosmodrome space launch facility in the world. And I think before that would ever blow back on Putin, you would see scapegoats. You would see lower level officials, construction bosses, sort of criminally charged for what they were doing. And there have been criminal cases for mid-level construction bosses and even high-level too, accused of pilfering state funds, sabotaging efforts even. And so I think that long before Putin got blamed for Vostochny, you would see mid-level officials be thrown under the bus.
Matthew Bodner, reporter for the Moscow Times, based in that great Russian city. Thanks very much for talking with us.
Thank you for having me. Have a good day.